Are you just plain sick and tired of all the content online being about massive houseplants? Stick around with me, and in this video I'll showcase some of my smaller plants, some that stay small, some that do get larger, but these might be of interest to people with limited space. Hi, my name is Memo, this is my channel, Houseplantygoodness, and essentially it's a place where I like to geek out about my big passion. You might be able to see some of it behind me, it's tropical houseplants. So as I just said, this is all going to be spotlighting some of the smaller, more diminutive plants in my collection. Obviously you can see the big ones behind me, and I've usually showcased some of the bigger specimens that I have, but actually the true unsung heroes a lot of the time tend to be the smaller plants. And as I said, there's a lot of people that have got limited space, and I don't just mean people in small apartments, I mean people that maybe have other plants and don't have that much space to give to more large plants. I know I'm not the only one based on comments from previous videos. But in this video I thought let's just showcase some of the smaller specimens that I have. And as I said, it's going to be some small plants that stay relatively small. Their growing habit is more diminutive, so it makes it easier to have it in your space. Plants that maybe don't get as wide either, so more columnar plants, and also plants that might be small, at least in my case right now for me, but they do have potential to get larger, and there is a place for those plants too. So without further ado, let's have a look at the first plant. So one of the first plants that I want to show is actually one that I just recently got, and I did an unboxing about this specific plant, and I'll put it up here, and it's it is one that I had done another video a while back talking about plants that I would like to try again. So this, I hide myself, hopefully it will focus, and it's got a bit of a crispy edge here that you might be able to see, and that was because the soil was a bit too dry when it arrived to me, which is absolutely fine for me because then it means I've got full control. And this is the Begonia bipinnatifida, I think, or pinnatifida, I think. Let me just check on that. It is the bipinnatifida. So I got that one right. But this is an example of a plant that does stay relatively small. And it can get a bit of height, but from what I've seen, even kind of slightly more mature specimens of this plant, they don't get absolutely ginormous. And I mean, obviously, you might be able to understand why I like the look and feel of this. Because if somebody was to show you this and just show you some of the foliage, you wouldn't necessarily be able to guess that it's a begonia. It's giving a lot more like fern, and maybe, I don't know, if you kind of squint hard enough, if you see some of that foliage, it almost looks a bit like it could be those kind of like more dainty bits of seaweed that you get, or at least I think we're pretty sure we get certain types of seaweed that look a bit like this in the Mediterranean. But yeah, this is a really, really good plant. And actually there's a few begonias that I can talk about that do stay relatively diminutive, and thus makes it a bit easier because this won't get too wide. It can do if you kind of have got multiple growing points in it, and it can kind of spread a bit that way, but it will be more columnar. It grows a bit more, and I think this might be a cane begonia, or it might belong to the same family because it doesn't have the traditional kind of rhizomatous begonia growing habit, which is a bit lower and a bit more spready. So this is an interesting one to consider if you don't have a lot of space. I'm not gonna lie, and if you see the other video that I was mentioning, this is not specifically an easy begonia to have, so you have been warned, but it is super sexy, at least in my opinion. And whilst we're on the topic of begonias, let me show you another one that is a good option. This is another cane type begonia, and I have spoken about this before. This is looking a bit crusty, and I've done a video about leaf curl, and I mentioned about diagnosing your plants. This is the Begonia amphioxus. Very, very cool. It's not looking the best at the moment. This one, for me, I've taken it out of a propagation bin quite recently. It's only recently, within the last few months, that it's been potted up in soil, so I expect it to throw a bit of a wobbly because the humidity level has changed, and this is something to be aware of if you're ever considering something like a Begonia amphioxus, because it can, and I've said this several times and I will keep saying it until I'm blue in the face, it can do well even in regular household humidity. It will look busted for about a year, 6 months to a year. So this is its teenage phase. So it's a spotty teenager at the moment. It's kind of throwing temper tantrums, but it can be a relatively straightforward plant if you can kind of grin your teeth and bear it and just kind of go, you know what, it might look a little busted, put it somewhere in the back that you can't see it. As long as you're getting the kind of level of light that it needs, you're fine. And then bring it a bit more to the forward when it's just that, look, you are no longer a spotty teenager. I mean, it's spotty by default because that's part of its charm and it's part of its look. But yeah, this is another one that will stay relatively diminutive. You can see again, it is kind of like a bit more like a cane begonia, janky support stick for the win. It's doing all of the things with this plant. Otherwise, this would just snap in half. But it is one of those things that this is a plant that will stay upright. It doesn't spread too much. Again, similar to the other begonia that I was just talking about, if you've got multiple growing points in the same pot, then yes, it will be wider, but it doesn't get particularly tall. And I've had the mother plant of this plant, which I had a year or two back, basically, it did get relatively tall, but it only didn't get about 30, 40 centimeters. I'm not good with like kind of measurements like that, but it wasn't particularly tall, and I don't think it would have ever got much taller generally. So this is an interesting one if you're a bit more limited on space, because it can go upright. Let's have a look at a plant that is again quite diminutive. This is the Piper ribesioides. And I will show you kind of what the leaves look like. I know pipers can be a bit challenging for some people, and you're probably noticing a bit of a trend here when I'm talking about some of these plants that do stay relatively small. You can see this one will trail. If I was to give it something like a plank or a moss pole, it would probably do a bit better, because if you look at the back of it, it is a bit more of a shingling plant, so it would want to attach to something on the side and then grow upwards. But you're noticing a bit of a theme with some of these plants where I'm just like, they're okay, they're really good, they stay small, but, and there's always a but, with a lot of them, not all of them, the issue that you're going to have is a lot of these plants, in an ideal world, they would be grown in a terrarium. And a lot of the times, the reasons why some of these are on the market is because they are pretty much sold as terrarium plants. Because unless you've got a traditional terrarium, I'm not talking about the IKEA glass cabinets that some people can kind of turn into a terrarium, but even those to a certain extent, a more traditional terrarium, which tends to be much smaller, because you don't realize how small a terrarium could be until you make a terrarium, and then you're just like, oh, I've got all of these plants and I thought they were going to fit because I bought them quite small, and actually even these plants are too big for the terrarium. So bear that in mind. And part of that means that because these plants were kind of pretty much not created, because obviously nature is creating these plants, but the reason why they are kind of sold more so in the market, other than like crazy people like me that likes pipers and will get most pipers that I can get my hands on, but it is predominantly for people that are in the kind of terrarium hobby to have something that they can put in a terrarium that stays relatively small, thus meaning that a lot of these plants would grow better in a terrarium. And by that I mean very high humidity, consistency and temperature, like the light levels are kind of based usually on artificial kind of grow lights. So bear that in mind with some of these plants that, yes, they are small and they are diminutive and they stay relatively small, but remember where they would be grown normally in a house, because obviously we've said this before, house plants, no plant is a house plant in its nature because most of these things would be growing outside, but a lot of these smaller, more diminutive plants, they'll live their best life in a terrarium, or in as long as you can replicate the conditions. I'm not telling you to turn your house into a terrarium, but as long as you can replicate it as closely as possible, these things will be happy. Because again, they weren't aimed at us, they weren't aimed at the regular like houseplant hobbyist, they are aimed mainly towards terrarium hobbyist. Okay, and my poor Alocasia Dragon Scale is doing better. It's kind of stabilizing a bit more, and you can kind of see that leaf there. I will never get over the leaves of an Alocasia Dragon Scale. just But if I'm not mistaken, dual alocasias, and this is an example of one. I can show you, let me see if I've got another one that I can show you. So similar type of vibe, and it does look a bit like it could be a dragon scale. This is the Alocasia sinuata, if I'm not mistaken. The dragon scale is the Alocasia beginda, if I'm not mistaken. But these plants, because they are kind of dual alocasias, they tend to be more diminutive. This is an example of a plant that, I mean, I am not going to repeat myself throughout this video. Any of the tropical plants would probably be better if you had a giant terrarium. And for a lot of people that have been with my channel for a while, my conservatory pretty much is a giant terrarium by this point. But these plants don't necessarily need a terrarium. Like I was talking about with the pipers, the begonias that we saw earlier on. These aren't necessarily aimed just at the terrarium folk. This is aimed at us people that might be interested in houseplants. So these are plants that they're a bit hardier in that respect. I mean, obviously it's still an alocasia. Even more so, it is a dual alocasia. And let me know in the comments down below, because I know some people struggle with alocasias, and I'm trying to figure out if there's a certain type of people that gets on with certain types of alocasias. So I can grow the big kind of standard alocasias until the cows are home, like the ones that are absolutely mahusive. Think of the Alocasia mycorrhiza, all of these things, the Alocasia zebrina. Give me any of those massive, the alocasias that can get absolutely massive, and I will smash it out the park. There's a bit of a humble brag, but I will do well with those. Give me a dual alocasia and I will struggle like nobody's business. I find that they are different. I find that the dual alocasias, for me, are less forgiving than the bigger, full-size kind of alocasias, the one that can get really, really large. And that's why I was saying, let me know in the comments down below if you've noticed something similar on your side. I'd be very curious. Like, do you do same as me? And this is predominantly for the people that do okay with alocasia. I know there is a huge number of people that do not get on with alocasias, and I'm really sorry if this has triggered anybody, because I know this can be a traumatic experience for some people. I don't want to ever see an alocasia again. I get you, I understand it completely. But for the people that do well with alocasia, do you do well with both the large alocasia and the dual alocasia, or is it similar to me that you maybe do better with the dual and maybe not the large, or you do better with the large and not so much with the dual? I'm really curious. I'm really, really curious, because for me, in my head at least, I know they are part of the same genus, but I find the care for them to be different, if that makes sense. So do let me know. I'm very curious. But yes, dual alocasias generally are a good option. And actually, let me show you one more. And I'm only showing you this because and people have known that this one has struggled. Alocasia aslanii. This is the one that was bleaching out, but I have finally got a new leaf. And this is getting less light now, so I'm really hoping I'm going to be able to stimulate more growth and more of those darker foliage. This is still very much a baby leaf, but I'm trying to look at the roots. The roots are looking okay. So hopefully this is on the mend. But you know me, warts and all on this channel. Everything does not look pretty, and everything does not lead to look pretty. Let it do its thing, because I know a lot of people that would have looked at this plant before it got this new leaf and just gone, you know what, I'm giving up. It's really ugly. But I'm just like, you know what, but look. It can generate a really good leaf. Just give it some time. Much like humans, give it half a chance and it might surprise you. This might shock some of the people on my channel. So this is going to be a very interesting one to see how it's going to pick up on camera. And I'll see if I can hide my face so it can focus a bit more. I mean, granted, this is a sprawling, but I mean, look at the size of the pot. This is the Alocasia, Peperomia sincorana, I think it is. And you can kind of see, possibly, if it's going to focus. Let me see if it'll focus this way. You might be able to see some of the reddiness in the back of the leaves. The leaves are very succulent. They're almost a bit translucent, I think. Just a tiny bit, So again, I don't know whether or not that's going to pick up. If I hide myself behind there, that might do. But it's very, very succulent leaves. The stems are like a burgundy blushy pink or red color. And Carrie, if you see this, look, it's doing well. It's kind of feral. I'm curious to see is yours feral as well. But It's doing really, really well. This is not Peperomia that I think a lot of people, because this is a conversation I was having with Carrie a while back, and this was part of a trade that we did at some point. But this is one that not a lot of people have. I'm trying to think, there is a Peperomia that I used to own that is very similar to this, but it isn't this one. And it's much more diminutive and it stays small and it's got the green, really deep green on the top and really red at the bottom. And I cannot remember what it's called at the moment in time. I'm sure there's going to be loads of you screaming at me down in the comments below. But yeah, do let me know, do remind me. Ironically enough, that was a video, and if my friend that I'm thinking is watching this, because I think occasionally he does watch some channels. Walter, if you're watching this, hi Walter. You did get a few of the propagations of that plant, and you've propagated it successfully several times since. I think last time I was over at your place that you had quite a few, so. But Peperomias generally will stay small. I mean, this is a bad example because this sprawls, but they will stay relatively diminutive, stay kind of a bit more upright, generally. Bad example, as I said, I don't have that many begonias, so Peperomias to show you, but they can stay quite small, they can be quite dainty. I mean, I'm not the first one that's going to tell you that a Peperomia generally is good if you're limited on space or if you've got less space or if you live in an apartment. There's been enough of us that have talked about this for a long time. The one that I can really think of who is almost like the main ambassador for Peperomia is Nick Pileggi, and I can't. It's been a while since I've kind of checked out videos. I don't know if Nick's still kind of creating videos on YouTube or if he stopped actually, but he used to, and I'm sure he still loves his Peperomias. They weren't for me, I tried, but there's a lot of people that do love Peperomias, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention them, especially in the section when I'm talking about slightly smaller plants when you are limited on space. Again, bad example, but even this example, you can imagine if you were to kind of like put it somewhere and as long as you kind of attach it like that, it still doesn't take up that much space in reality. Right, and starting to look at some plants that can be small. So this is an Anthurium vittariifolium, believe it or not, this is quite small. I mean, obviously this will get large. This will get large. This is the Mama Jamma plant that the kind of genetic material came for these ones, but these are two seedlings. So there is that to consider. And the reason why I'm showing this, before you all kind of scream at me in the comments going, but this is not necessarily a plant that's going to stay small. True, but there is something to be said about plants that you can get in a relatively small size before they get large. And then what you can do is decide on what's going to happen with it in your space. I'm sorry, I know that I'm enabling, but it is one of those things that you can start with something, and depending on how good you are with seedlings, you can get a diminutive plant. This plant it's grown a lot more this year. I've put it in soil. It's doing a lot better than it ever did in semi-hydro, I will say that. I've found that seedling Anthuriums, for me, tend to do better in soil after they've moved out of like the damp sphagnum moss, usually where they start their lives out for me. And then eventually when they are a much more robust plant, believe it or not, and they've got slightly more stable roots, I know there's a bit of a shock in a transition period, then moving them into semi-hydro, for me, tends to work a bit better. But this hasn't grown a huge amount in nearly 2 years. So I'm okay to say that some of these plants, like even certain Anthuriums that might be seedlings, you might be at the seedling stage in a much more manageable stage. I'm not talking about a couple of weeks, I'm talking about potentially a year, maybe 2. I mean, obviously they will start sizing up. But then, and that's the point I'm trying to make, you can make that decision of kind of saying, you know what, I really like you and I've seen you through the transition of your entire life, and I can see you from when you're like little tiny baby and you've grown well in my conditions all of this time and you are now large, I will make space for you. Or you could have the flip side of this going, I'm really bored of you, you've taken too long to get much larger, I preferred you when you were like a smaller size, I don't particularly like you now that you're huge. Here's a friend who might be able to, who'd be more than happy to get the plant. And also, something that a lot of people don't talk about, starting off something small like this and getting it to a more mature size, even if you don't want to keep it, and this is more for the people that might be wanting to make a quick buck, basically, sell it. Sell a slightly more mature specimen, especially if you don't have space for it and you don't want to keep it. You'll make some money out of it. You've got all the enjoyment of seeing it for when you wanted it, when it was smaller and younger, and then sell it on for a lot more money probably than what you got your seedling, to somebody as a more mature plant. Trust me, that is not a lose-lose situation. That is most definitely a win-win situation there. How about something that stays small but might spread? So think kind of begonia, rhizomatous begonias. This is very similar, and this is a plant that I'm experiencing for the first time, and I have been massively impressed with how well it has grown. This is an Episcia. So it's part of a Gesneriad family, so think African violets and things like that. African violets will stay... Don't laugh. The people that have watched that video, don't laugh. I still think they're a bit geriatric. I know there's a lot of fans out there. I'm not judging anybody. It's just for me, my own personal opinion on them. These, similar vein, still a bit geriatric, but a bit more interesting for me. For me. But, I mean, look at that. And for the people that have been here for a while, when I went and did the plant swap in London, and I'll link the video at the top, if I hide myself, you can see some of this smallish foliage. That's how it started. When was it? End of October. We're now middle of December-ish. It's a couple of months, and I am already getting much, much larger leaves. Very, very cool. Yes. Does it spread a bit more? It does. But it hasn't added any height, and it won't add any height based on what I'm seeing from its growth habit. When I first got it, it was quite lanky and kind of like it was trying to grow up and it wasn't, and it just kind of flopped down. But this doesn't take up a lot of space. It is quite interesting because you'll get those kind of leaves there. You can see that patination. There's a bit of blushing that's happening at the back. There's almost like a bronzy color. It's also like very pettable. It's got slightly fuzzy leaves. Very, very cool plants, and unfortunately not a lot of people talked about it. They were trying to have a moment, at least here in the UK, and I know that the moment was happening predominantly from one retailer. I think it was Grow Tropicals was really pushing these at some point, so I know a lot of people did get them at some point. I'd be curious if you were one of those people, do you still have your, not Episcia? Is it Episcia? I might be getting this wrong. I'll correct myself if I did. No, I'm thinking Peliscia Ming, which I've got upstairs. This is an Episcia. Impromptu Greek lessons. So both words, the reason why they confuse me, Poliskia, poli means many or a lot, and skia means shade. Poliskia, many shade or a lot of shade. Episcia, epi is something upon, so upon shade. So you can kind of see, at least for me with the Greek background, why those two names can get a bit confusing, basically. So Episcia is this, Poliskia is the Aurelia Ming, sometimes they call them Peliscias. I can't remember which one is the correct way of going for it, but I will see if I can add a picture here. It's struggling still, it's still losing a lot of leaves, but it is getting a lot more new leaves finally, because for a long time it was just losing leaves and not growing anything more. I've got a lot more leaves that are coming in now, so it's stabilizing. I think it's still throwing a wobbly, but small plants that maybe a bit harder to find these days generally because there's not that many of them out there. They're not rare, but these are ones that come in and out of trends. So if you do manage to see one of these, grab one. I don't think you're going to be disappointed. Now we're coming into kind of more succulent type plants, and this is an example of a succulent type plant. It doesn't look like what you would traditionally think of as a succulent plant, but this, and you might be able to see if I tilt it there, you can see all the little bulblets in there. This, if I'm not mistaken, might be considered a caudiciform plant because it does have a swollen base or a swollen kind of caudex. It kind of looks a bit like a tuber. This is a Drimiopsis maculata, I think. Yes, Drimiopsis maculata. I had to check. It's great. I did remember. And what you might, hopefully is coming up. Can you see the stem of this? It's got a slight zebra-y pattern on it. Very, very cool plant. I don't talk about this very often. It's looking horrendous at the moment. And the reason why it's looking horrendous at the moment, and this is one to bear in mind again, because some of these plants might have something seasonal changes that happens to them. This is a plant that in the winter will pretty much either go down to the bulb. These bulbs are not dead. They've lost their foliage that they had in the spring and summer. They've gone back down to the bulb. They did this last year as well. And they'll resprout again in the spring. And you still get a few kind of straggly little leaves that will come up depending on the conditions that you give this. But this does stay quite small. It hasn't got much bigger. It hasn't been repotted in coming up to a second year now. It doesn't need it just yet because you might be able to see some of the roots there. But it's still got a lot of like growing material to grow into before it starts getting root bound, and it's absolutely fine. So this is an example of a succulent, but there are loads of different succulents out there. I will show you a picture of a recent succulent that I got, which is a Senecio staphyliformis, I think, and you might be able to see, again, this was part of the unboxing, but again, a lot of the succulents will tend to stay a bit smaller. Granted, you need to think about light levels for things like that, but they will stay much more diminutive. I'm not talking about necessarily cacti, because some of the cacti it will take years for them to get really large, but some of the euphorbias might tend to grow a bit faster, that look a bit more like a cactus, but not technically a true cactus. But a lot of the succulent type plants that are sold as succulents tend to be really small. So if you're strapped for space, it is definitely one of those things that you might want to consider. I know, and hopefully you won't mind me saying this, I know North, that I did a video with a while back, and I will link the video at the top there. North has a really impressive collection of succulents, but actually he's got loads and loads of plants. He's got them under a grow light, he's got them on shelves, but actually he's got quite a large number of succulents in one shelf and then in another shelf, so it doesn't actually take too much space. So they're really cool plants to consider if you're a bit limited on space. Yes, they can grow larger and some might grow faster than others, but they can be quite cool little plants to grow. And I'll finish off on an orchid. So, or orchid types. So this is a Bulbophyllum. This is a specific Bulbophyllum, and you can see, again, part of that original unboxing that I did quite recently, actually, because ain't got no willpower. This is what happens. But these, you can see, I mean, it's mounted, and you can kind of see what I meant now by how I was going to mount it. I was kind of mentioning that on that video. This is a 3D printed kind of backing that I did for it. Big holes, moss. And I know before anybody says it, they don't traditionally grow on moss, and you tend to want to have something a bit more chunky and airy, but this is kind of directly in front of a fan. So this moss has a dry cycle much faster than it would do normally if it was just kind of sitting out there. So one thing that you could do with plants, if space is an issue, is mounting plants. Even more so, you can get very small mounting plants as well. So it takes up very little space. And you can imagine with something like this, and I've done this for some of my other orchids, is this sits on a hook there, and it's on a shelf that's kind of hanging at the back there. So there's a hook there. But because these have also got holes, I can put a hook there and a hook there and have another one underneath it, another one underneath. And you can see how it then becomes a bit of a panel of small plants, and you still get that green vibe, and you can kind of make it a bit more of an interesting wall feature as well. So don't be sleeping on some of these orchids. They might not be the easiest thing in the world, but actually if you crack the care for them, they're actually no harder than a Phalaenopsis orchid, at least in my opinion. But yeah, that was just a small selection of some of my more small and diminutive plants, more so for ideas and maybe to start up a conversation down below to see what you think. I probably did miss quite a few smaller, more diminutive plants. There is one that I can't get out, which, every time, and the people that have watched enough videos will know the ones that I'm thinking of right now. Because I'm looking at the variegated plant, which again, I'm forgetting the name. I put it at the top there, and you can all laugh at me for the fact that I keep forgetting the damn plant's name. So, but there are loads of plants out there that could be of interest. Smaller kind of begonias, plants like the piper and things like that, that might be more aimed towards terrariums, and if you can replicate the conditions, they will be really happy for you. Plants that could get larger, like the anthuriums that we were talking about. Some of the alocasias, the jewel alocasias that are smaller. You can get some of the, is it jewel orchids? Maybe it is jewel orchids as well, smaller kind of orchids, more terrestrial type orchids. And all of these things can kind of compound as well. Like you saw some of the succulents, some of the mountable orchids, not necessarily just mountable, but they can be quite small. There are a lot of options out there of plants that will stay relatively compact if space is an issue for you, basically. And let's be real, it's an issue for me as well, not that you would think of, but I know where I'm putting these things. Yeah, just a little hole, fit it there. You'll be fine, just stay there. Might be 200 plants around you, just a little, like, kind of like 5 or 10 inches of like space of circumference that you can just comfortably sit in there. The light might be questionable, but you'll be fine. You will be fine. You will survive. How many people are like that? It's not just me. But yeah, like, what did you think? Tell me your opinions. Did I miss? I definitely did. But did I miss some of your favorite plants? Let me know down below and let's have that conversation. But yeah. Hopefully you've enjoyed, hopefully I shall see you here soon, and I truly, truly hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thanks, bye.